The first thing Wren Calloway noticed when she stepped into the lawyer's office was the smell, polished wood, cold coffee, the particular stillness of a room where important things had already been decided before anyone sat down. She was 29 years old. She had driven 4 hours from Portland through November rain. She had not slept the night before, not really, because when the phone had rung at 11:15 with a number she didn't recognize, something in the quality of the silence before the voice spoke told her that whatever came next would not be something she could sleep through. The voice had been male, flat, professional in the way that people are professional when they have delivered the same news so many times that the words have lost whatever weight they once carried. Your father passed this morning. Reading of the will is Friday 10 a.m., Holston Associates, downtown Portland. Then nothing. The line simply ended. Wren had sat in the dark of her apartment for a long time after that. Not crying, just sitting. She and Dale Merritt had not been a simple kind of family. He had not been a simple kind of father, but he had been hers in all the complicated, unspoken ways that mattered. And now the phone was quiet in her hand, and the apartment was very dark, and the only sound was the rain against the windows. Dale James Merritt, 68 years old, retired defense engineer, a man who had never once said I love you in the 30 years she had known him, but who had also never once failed to be sitting at the kitchen table when she came downstairs at 2 in the morning, unable to sleep. Not asking, not offering, just there. He had taken her in when she was 5. After the accident on Highway 30 that took her parents on a January night in 1995, she had spent 3 months in a foster placement before Dale Merritt had appeared with paperwork in a quiet, deliberate kind of certainty that had confused everyone involved, including Wren herself. He was a bachelor. He was 50. He owned a house on the outskirts of Astoria that smelled like machine oil and old technical manuals. He had no particular qualifications for fatherhood. What he had was the ability to look at a grieving, furious 5-year-old and say without any particular sentiment, "You seem like someone who thinks for herself. That's useful. Come on." And she had gone. The Holston Associates building was glass and gray stone in downtown Portland, the kind of architecture that communicates permanence and cost without saying anything interesting. Wren took the elevator to the 4th floor and followed a receptionist down a corridor that smelled like the inside of a leather briefcase. Petra Holst was already seated at the head of the conference table when Wren entered. 47 years old, silver hair cut close and practical, gold-framed glasses, the posture of a woman who had been sitting at the heads of tables for 20 years and had long since stopped finding it notable. She looked up when Wren came in, nodded once, and then looked back down at the papers in front of her. And there was Sutton Vance. He was seated across the table from where Wren would sit, and the first thing that registered was the way he was already arranged. Not waiting, arranged, suit jacket with the faintest gray stripe, brown leather watch strap, hands folded on the table in front of him with the particular relaxation of a man who has already done his calculations and found them satisfactory. He was 54 years old. He had been Dale Merritt's business partner for nearly 20 years, a lawyer-turned-developer who had partnered with Dale in a coastal property company called Merritt Vance Development, LLC, back in 2004. Wren had met him perhaps a dozen times over the years. He had always been pleasant to her, polished and pleasant in the way certain men are pleasant when they have no particular need to be anything else. He looked at her now as she sat down and he smiled. It was a small smile, knowing in a way she couldn't quite locate. Petra Holst cleared her throat and began to read. The language was standard for the first several pages. Personal effects, accounts, the house in Astoria where Wren had grown up, where she had learned to read sitting at a kitchen table covered in engineering manuals, where she had spent 18 years of her life. The car, the workshop. Then Petra turned a page and her voice continued in the same flat professional register, and Wren heard the sentence that would change everything. The entirety of the estate, including all financial accounts, real property, and associated assets, is to be transferred to Mr. Sutton Vance. The room did not change. The light through the windows was the same November gray it had been a moment before. Petra's expression was the same careful neutral, but something shifted in the air the way pressure shifts before a storm, invisible and unmistakable. Wren did not stand. She did not raise her voice. She had learned from Dale Merritt that the first and most important thing you do when something unexpected happens is go very still and look and make sure you understand what you are actually seeing before you respond to it. She looked at Petra Holst and she said quietly, the date of signing. Petra glanced down at the papers. September 14th. My father was admitted to the hospital on September 12th. A silence. Petra's eyes stayed on the page. He was on morphine by the evening of September 12th. Wren continued. I spoke with the attending nurse, who witnessed the signature. It was Sutton who answered. He placed one hand flat on the table, a gesture of calm and finality, and his voice was the voice of a man explaining something to someone who was upset and therefore not thinking clearly. Dale was lucid enough to make his wishes known, Wren. The attending physician confirmed his capacity. Which physician? I'd like the name. Sutton smiled again. The same small, knowing smile. Wren, your father made his decision. The respectful thing is to honor it. And in that moment, Wren did something she had not planned to do. She looked at Petra Holst instead of Sutton. She looked directly at her and she waited. Petra did not look up. She kept her eyes on the papers in front of her, with the fixed, determined attention of a woman who has decided that if she does not look at something, she does not have to be responsible for it. Her jaw was tight. A single muscle near her left temple worked once, then went still. She knew. Whatever was wrong with that signature, whatever had happened between September 12th and September 14th in a hospital room, Petra Holst knew about it. Wren filed that away. She looked back at Sutton and she said nothing further. There was nothing useful to be said in this room with this man at this table. She understood that now with a clarity that felt almost like cold water. She signed what Petra put in front of her. She accepted the single item that had been designated for her in the will. A steel key on a plain ring and a folded slip of paper with GPS coordinates written in Dale Merritt's unmistakable handwriting. The print precise and slightly cramped, the penmanship of a man who had spent 40 years writing technical specifications. At the bottom of the slip, one line. Where the stone stands, you'll find shelter. And below that, in smaller letters, something Wren read 3 times before she fully registered it. Don't go alone if you can help, but if you must go alone, don't trust anyone until they prove it. She folded the paper. She put it in her jacket pocket with the key. She stood and she left the room, and Sutton Vance watched her go with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has just won a game no one else knew was being played. She was in the elevator alone when she allowed herself one full breath of the anger she had been sitting on since the moment Petra had turned that page. Just one breath. Then she let it out slow and deliberate, and the elevator doors opened on the lobby, and she walked out. She had reached the stairwell door, intending to take the stairs down to the parking garage when she heard a voice behind her. Excuse me, Wren Calloway. The woman was 63 years old, and she looked like someone who had spent decades in coastal weather. Denim jacket worn soft with age, gray hair pulled back low, the kind of face that has settled into its own particular patience over a long time. She was standing near the wall, slightly apart from the foot traffic of the corridor, as if she had been waiting and had not wanted to be noticed while she waited. I'm Marin Quill, she said. I've been Dale's neighbor in Astoria for 25 years. He asked me to give you something. She paused. Only you. She held out a thick envelope. Wren took it. Inside was a photograph printed on standard paper, but taken at an unusual angle, low and wide, as if the camera had been set on a floor. The image showed a room. Not the kind of room you would expect to find anywhere, but particularly not at the end of a set of GPS coordinates on the Oregon coast. There were screens, racks of equipment, cables labeled in the same cramped handwriting as the slip of paper in Wren's pocket. The room was clean. The room was lit. The room was unmistakably operational. The second thing in the envelope was a birthday card, her own from when she was 10 years old. The cover had a cartoon dog on it. She remembered it. She had kept it on her dresser for 2 years before it fell behind the furniture and was lost. Dale had found it, apparently, and kept it. On the back in his handwriting was a single line. The child who solves this puzzle is the only child I trust with what I've kept for 20 years. Wren stood in the corridor of a law firm in downtown Portland, reading the back of a birthday card she hadn't seen since she was 12, and she felt the floor of the situation shift under her feet. Then she heard footsteps. Sutton Vance came around the corner from the direction of the elevators. He was moving with purpose, but not haste. He never moved with haste. He saw Marin and he stopped, and the pleasant, polished surface of him went through a change that lasted only a fraction of a second, but was completely legible to anyone paying attention. "Mrs. Quill." His voice had dropped. Not a threat. Something adjacent to a threat, careful enough to maintain deniability. "I thought I made myself clear." Marin did not move. She had the stillness of someone who has decided a long time ago that she is done being moved by men who speak to her in that particular tone. "You said a lot of things to me, Sutton," she said. "I don't recall agreeing to any of them." Sutton's eyes moved to Wren, then back to Marin. He said nothing for a moment, and in that moment his right hand moved slightly, almost imperceptibly, toward the inside pocket of his jacket. Not reaching for anything. Just the unconscious gesture of a man reminding himself that his phone is there. He turned and walked back toward the elevators without another word. Marin watched him go. Then she turned to Wren and she spoke quickly and quietly, the words already prepared. "Don't go back to your apartment directly. Don't let anyone know which direction you're going. And don't go to that address alone." She pressed a small card into Wren's hand, a folded piece of paper with a phone number written on it. "Call me when you get there. If I don't hear from you in 24 hours, I have people I can call." She was already moving away before Wren could respond. She went down the stairwell, not the elevator. The door closed behind her. Wren stood alone in the corridor for 3 seconds. Then she looked down at the photograph again. The room with the screens and the labeled cables and the low, warm light. She looked at Dale's handwriting on the back of the birthday card. The child who solves this puzzle. She put everything back in the envelope and put the envelope in her bag and walked to the parking garage. She did not go back to her apartment. She drove east for 6 blocks, parked in a lot she had never used before, took her laptop from the back seat, and sat for 12 minutes composing an email. She addressed it to a college friend, the person on earth she trusted most without qualification. The email contained the GPS coordinates, a summary of the morning's events, and one instruction: "If you don't hear from me in 24 hours, forward this to the FBI field office in Portland." She included the address. She encrypted the email. She sent it. Then she turned off location to services on her phone, pulled up an offline map she had downloaded 2 months ago for a camping trip she had never taken, entered the coordinates, and pulled out of the lot. The coordinates led north, Pacific Highway up the coast, then smaller roads, then smaller still, until she was on a 2-lane that ran between dense Douglas fir and the sound of the ocean, invisible but constant, a low percussion behind everything. She checked the mirror. The rain had started again. Headlights behind her a reasonable distance back. She had been watching them since Portland. She took an unmarked left turn onto a side road that wasn't on the offline map, something she'd noticed on a satellite image while she was parked. The headlights followed. She made a second turn. The headlights followed. She noted this without panic, the way Dale had taught her to note things. Not by saying anything, just by demonstrating year after year what it looked like to take in information without immediately reacting to it. She pulled into a gravel lot in front of a closed bait shop, parked and sat for 4 minutes. The headlights did not appear on the road behind her. Then she drove on. She thought about Sutton's hand moving toward his inside pocket, about the way he had looked at Marin, about Petra Holst's eyes fixed on that page with the deliberateness of someone not permitting themselves to look up. She thought about the last real conversation she had had with Dale. 3 weeks before he went to the hospital, he had called on a Tuesday evening, which was unusual. He was not a Tuesday evening caller. His voice had been slightly different. Not frightened, something she did not have a word for at the time, but was beginning to understand now. He had said, "Wren, if something happens to me, don't trust what they put in front of you on paper. Find what I left in your hands." She had asked him what he meant. The line had gone quiet for a moment, and then he had said he had to go. And 2 weeks later, he was in the hospital, and a week after that, he was gone, and she had never had the chance to ask again. "Find what I left in your hands." She was holding a steel key on a plain ring, and she was driving north toward a set of coordinates on the Oregon coast, and she did not yet know what the key opened or what she was going to find when she got there. But she was beginning to understand that whatever it was, Dale had been building toward it for a very long time. That the phone call on a Tuesday evening had not been a warning so much as the final piece of a plan he had already completed. Miles behind her, in a glass and steel office in downtown Portland, on the fourth floor, Sutton Vance was standing in front of a monitor. On the screen was a map. On the map was a single moving point, blue and steady, traveling north along the coast. He was looking at it with the focused attention of a man watching an investment. "She's moving," he said. Brooks Egan was standing behind him, 36 years old, former Marine. The kind of man whose particular stillness is not calm so much as readiness, a held position rather than a resting one. He had worked for Sutton Vance for 8 years in various capacities, and the nature of those capacities had never required detailed documentation. He did not respond to Sutton's observation. He had already seen the screen. He was already thinking 3 steps past it. "How long to the coordinates?" Sutton asked. 4 hours from here. Less if we take the highway north." Sutton watched the moving point. "Give her time to find it. I want to know what's there before we move." Brooks nodded once. The nod of a man who has received orders of this type before and understands exactly what following them will require. Wren reached the turnoff just before dark. The road had gone from 2 lanes to 1, to something that was technically a road only because someone had once driven on it enough times to leave a track. The trees were thick on both sides, and then suddenly they weren't, and she came over a low rise and stopped the car. The Pacific Ocean was below her, a long way below, separated from where she was standing by a cliff that dropped straight down into gray water and white foam. The wind hit the windshield and the car shuddered slightly. She checked the coordinates. This was it. She could see nothing from here that looked like what was in the photograph. No structure, no entrance, nothing but a broad stretch of rock and scrubby coastal grass and a tumbled group of very large boulders near the cliff edge, their surfaces dark with moisture and lichen. She parked the car as far off the track as she could manage behind a natural screen of rock. Not in the open. Old habit. Dale had taught her to park that way when they went hiking in the Coast Range, always thinking about what you were visible from, always thinking about what you were announcing to the landscape. She got out of the car. The wind hit her with the full force of a Pacific November salt and cold and something faintly mineral. And for a moment, it was simply physical, the sheer animal reality of standing on a cliff above the ocean in the rain. She stood there and looked at the boulders. Then she walked towards them, and as she came around the largest of the group, she saw it, low to the ground. Concrete slab cracked the surface dark with age. A door in it, metal-stained orange-brown with decades of salt air, the hinges thickened with rust. Overgrown along the base with the kind of determined coastal vegetation that will cover anything given enough years and enough rain. It looked like a decommissioned pump station from the 1970s. It looked like nothing. It looked like precisely the kind of thing you would walk past without registering if you did not already know to look for it. Wren stood in front of it, and she took the steel key out of her pocket. She looked at the door. She looked at the key. And she saw what should have been obvious and wasn't, not at first, not until you were standing directly in front of it. There was no keyhole, no lock mechanism visible anywhere on the surface of the door. The key in her hand was real and solid and purposeful, the weight and precision of something made to do a specific job. But there was nothing on this door that it could do. She turned the key over in her palm. She looked at the door again. She looked at the frame, the hinges, the concrete surround. Dale Merritt had left her a key that didn't open anything she could see. He had left her coordinates to a structure with no visible point of entry. He had written on the back of her childhood birthday card that he trusted her with what he had kept the child who solved his puzzles. The rain came down harder. The ocean moved far below. Somewhere on a highway to the south, a blue point was moving north on a map on a screen in a downtown office. Wren put the key back in her pocket and looked more carefully at the surface of the door. And she began to think. She found it by feel, not instinct, not luck. The deliberate, methodical kind of finding that comes from slowing down when everything in you wants to speed up. She had been standing in the rain for 11 minutes running the beam of her flashlight along the concrete frame when her fingers brushed a section of the surface that was wrong. Not visibly wrong. Wrong the way a note played slightly flat is wrong. Almost too subtle to name but impossible to unhear once you've noticed it. She pressed her palm flat against it. The texture was different, finer. The weathering pattern didn't match the surrounding concrete, as if this section had been poured later or protected from something the rest of the slab had been exposed to. She moved the flashlight closer and tilted it low, nearly parallel to the surface, so the beam raked across at an angle instead of hitting it straight on. The marks appeared. They were shallow, deliberate, and they had been there for years. Geometric shapes cut into the concrete with something narrow and precise, each one perhaps 2 inches across, worn enough by time and weather to be invisible in normal light, but suddenly unmistakably clear in the raking beam. A curve, an acute angle, a shape that repeated twice. Not random, a sequence. Wren lowered herself to one knee in the wet grass, bringing her eyes level with the marks, and she looked at them for a long moment without touching anything. Her heart was doing something complicated in her chest, not fear, something older and stranger, the feeling of a door opening inside a door. She was 10 years old, sitting at the kitchen table in Astoria with a geometry puzzle Dale had left for her before he went to work. She had been staring at it for an hour, getting nowhere. And when he came home, he had sat down across from her, and he hadn't touched the puzzle or told her the answer. He had just said quietly, "You're trying to force it. Stop forcing it. Ask the puzzle what it wants." She had been furious with that answer at the time. She was not furious with it now. She looked at the sequence of marks. She looked at the key in her hand. She understood in a way that required no further explanation that the key was not a key in any conventional sense. It was an instrument. It was meant to be oriented, not turned. She found the slot by working her fingers along the edge of the frame, a narrow channel between 2 uneven ridges invisible, unless you were looking for it at exactly the right height. She seated the key in it. Nothing happened. She studied the first mark, a curve bowing left. She rotated the key fractionally to follow it. Nothing. She studied the second mark, the acute angle pointing down and right. She adjusted. Nothing. She held the third mark in her mind, the one that repeated, and she moved the key through both repetitions of the shape in a single continuous motion. The sound came from deep inside the structure, low and mechanical, and absolutely certain, the sound of something that had been waiting a very long time for the right instruction. A single heavy clunk, like a bolt the size of her forearm, releasing from its housing. Then the wall moved, not the door she had been looking at, the wall beside it, a section of concrete she had taken for solid, perhaps 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, separated along a seam that had been engineered to be invisible and was, until this moment, completely successful at it. It didn't swing. It slid hydraulic and unhurried on a mechanism that had been sealed against 20 years of coastal weather and was working perfectly. Warm air came out, filtered, dry, temperature controlled. The smell of a room that was maintained, not abandoned. Light followed. Amber and steady, the automatic illumination of a space that had registered an authorized entry. Wren stood up from her knee. She looked into the opening. Then she looked back at the rain and the dark and the ocean somewhere below the cliff. And then she looked forward again. She walked in. The door slid closed behind her without a sound. The space was 40 feet long and 25 feet wide, and every inch of it had been built with intention. The right wall held equipment racks from floor to ceiling, hard drives and processing units in black housings, each one connected to a labeled cable, each label written in Dale's handwriting. The left wall was covered by a map of the Oregon coast from Astoria south to Lincoln City, overlaid with a dense network of colored lines and marked points in red, blue, and yellow, the cartography of something she didn't yet have the framework to understand. In the center of the room, a workstation with 6 monitors arranged in a curve. And in the far right corner, a desk chair that had been used enough to carry the permanent impression of the person who had sat in it. Wren moved to the nearest equipment rack and read the cable labels. Power distribution, primary storage array, backup satellite uplink, environmental control. Each label in the same unhurried, precise hand. He had not been rushed when he wrote these. He had known exactly what he was building and exactly how long he intended it to last. She was about to move toward the workstation when she saw what was on the lowest shelf of the nearest rack. Between a power conditioner and a coil of Ethernet cable sitting with no particular ceremony, as if it belonged there the same way the technical equipment belonged there, was a small wooden picture frame. She picked it up. The photograph inside showed her at approximately 12 years old, asleep on the living room sofa in the Astoria house, a technical manual open on her chest with her fingers still marking a page. She had no memory of the picture being taken. The living room lamp was on behind her, and the light fell across her face in a way that made her look, she thought, very young and very peaceful in the way that people only look peaceful when they don't know they're being observed. She turned the frame over. On the cardboard backing in Dale's handwriting, 4 words. The reason for all of this. Wren stood in the middle of an underground facility on the Oregon coast and held a picture of herself sleeping at age 12, and she felt something move through her that was not grief exactly, and not love exactly, and not anger exactly, but contained elements of all three. A wave of something so complete it had no clean name. She set the frame back on the shelf, carefully upright, so the photograph faced outward. Then she went to work. The workstation came alive the moment she sat down, the 6 monitors cycling from standby to active, in sequence displaying a login interface she had never seen before. Not a password prompt. A single physical reader built into the left edge of the desk, a small square of dark glass slightly recessed into the surface. She placed her right index finger on it. The screens changed. A single line of text appeared across the central monitor, white on dark. "Welcome home, Wren." She had perhaps 3 seconds to feel the full weight of that sentence before the next thing happened. A warning window appeared, automated and immediate, as if it had been cued to display at exactly this moment of first access. The header read "Security Alert." Below it, 2 lines of information that she read twice to make sure she understood them correctly. Unauthorized remote access attempt detected. Date September 28th, origin IP. Address traced and logged. Vance Legal Group, 4th floor, 1240 Southwest Morrison Street, Portland, Oregon. Sutton had tried to get in. Not physically. Remotely through the network on the same day Dale had been admitted to the hospital. He had known this facility existed, had known it long enough to have an approach ready, and he had moved on it within hours of Dale losing consciousness. He had not gotten in. The system had logged the attempt and locked the access point, and whatever he had tried, it had not been enough, because the system required what no one else could provide. Wren looked at her own fingerprint on the reader. Dale had registered her. At some point, without telling her, he had taken her fingerprints and built them into the authentication system of a facility she hadn't known existed. She didn't know when. She didn't know how. What she knew was that he had done it deliberately, and that the choice of biometric authentication meant only one thing: he had designed this so that no one could access it by force or by fraud. You couldn't steal a fingerprint the way you could steal a password. You couldn't compel it from someone who didn't know they had it. He had made her the key before she even knew there was a lock. She navigated the interface carefully, methodically, starting with what was immediately accessible. The first layer of files opened without additional credentials, and what she found there was organized with the same precision as the cable labels on the equipment rack, a documented record of financial fraud, 11 years of it laid out in chronological order with supporting materials attached to each entry. Merritt Vance Development is an LLC, established 2004. Dale and Sutton had been equal partners in a coastal land development company that had, over the years that followed, acquired and managed significant property along the Oregon coast. The financial records in this first layer showed a pattern of transfers beginning in 2006, 2 years into the partnership. Money moving from the company's operating accounts through a series of intermediary entities, 2 Delaware LLCs, and 1 Nevada holding company, before arriving in accounts that bore no visible connection to Sutton Vance, but whose ownership structures Dale had traced with painstaking care. $4.3 million over 11 years. The documentation was complete. Timestamps, account numbers, copies of wire transfer records, annotated analysis in Dale's handwriting in the margins of printed spreadsheets. Then she found the audio file. It was in a subfolder labeled simply 2019 Office. And when she opened it, the recording began without preamble. A room with the particular acoustic quality of a large office space. Two voices. Sutton's voice first calm and businesslike. Move it through the third account first. Nobody traces it back if it's split. Then Dale's voice. She had not heard it in 3 months, and the physical shock of it, the specific timbre of it in her inner ear was something she was not prepared for. He sounded tired. He sounded like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had made a decision about how to set it down. Sutton, this is the last time. A pause. Then Sutton, and in his voice something that was almost gentle, the patience of a man who has had this conversation before and knows how it ends. Dale, you've said that 3 times. The recording ended. Wren sat with her hands still on the desk and the silence of the room pressing in around her. She went deeper. A second layer of files accessible through a secondary credential she found written in pencil on the underside of the desk drawer, the kind of hiding place so simple it circled back around to clever. What she found in the second layer changed the shape of what she was looking at. It was not just Sutton stealing from Dale. It was Dale knowing from nearly the beginning and making a choice. The documents in this layer were Dale's own records, private and internal, written for no audience but himself. He had known about the transfers by late 2007. He had confronted Sutton in 2008 and accepted what amounted to a private arrangement. The transfers would continue at a reduced rate, and a portion of what moved through Sutton's shadow accounts would be reinvested indirectly and untraceable into the construction and operation of this facility. Dale had needed capital that couldn't appear in official records because the facility itself couldn't appear in official records because the contracts he still held with federal agencies required disclosure of certain asset classes, and this, whatever this was not something he was prepared to disclose. He had used Sutton's fraud as a funding mechanism. He had let it continue because he needed it to continue. And then when the facility was complete and the need was over, he had begun to build the case. Wren sat back in the desk chair. She looked at the ceiling. She breathed. Dale Merritt had not been a simple man. She had known that. She had known it in the way you know the shape of something you have lived with so long, you've stopped seeing it clearly. But this was different. This was the complete picture of someone who had made a series of choices that were not clean, not uncomplicated, and had lived with them and had ultimately decided to leave behind both the evidence of what Sutton had done and the evidence of his own complicity, trusting her to hold the whole truth rather than just the portion that reflected well on him. She thought of the photograph on the shelf, the reason for all of this. She was not sure in this moment exactly what she felt about that. She was still sitting with it when the monitors changed. All 6 screens switched simultaneously from the file interface to a grid of camera feeds. 8 of them, exterior cameras covering different angles of the terrain above the facility. The system had detected motion and triggered automatic surveillance mode. She leaned forward. 2 sets of headlights, one from the north access track and one from the south, converging on the same point above her. 4 doors opening, 5 figures getting out, though in the low-resolution infrared, she couldn't identify faces yet. Then one of the figures moved toward the camera position on the northwest boulder cluster, and she recognized the economy of movement before she could see the face clearly. The way he covered ground. The way he checked angles before committing to a direction. Brooks Egan. He found the first camera in under 90 seconds. He didn't hesitate, didn't scan for it. He went directly to it and pulled a piece of dark cloth from his jacket and covered the lens with the efficiency of someone who has done this particular thing before. 1 camera gone, he moved immediately toward the second position. Wren switched to a backup feed, a secondary camera built into a crevice in the rock face at ground level, its housing disguised as a shadow, still active. Through this camera, she could now see Sutton stepping out of the second vehicle. He adjusted the collar of his coat against the wind unhurried. He looked at the bunker entrance for a moment, then looked at his watch. He said something to the man standing nearest to him. She activated the external microphone array before she fully decided to do it. His voice came through the speakers, slightly distorted by wind, but clear enough. Give her 20 minutes. I want her to find the main system before we move. If she's already into the files, this goes faster. Ren absorbed this. He hadn't just followed her. He had planned to let her find it, let her unlock it because she was the only one who could, and then take whatever she had found. She was the key, and once the door was open, he had no further use for the key. The motion sensors registered the first impact against the outer concrete shell at 11:42. Not a tool, a test, a solid strike to map the resistance standard procedure before a breach operation. She knew this because Dale had explained structural engineering to her for years in the particular way he explained things, not as lessons, but as context information she might someday find useful without either of them specifying when or why. The second impact registered 30 seconds later, and the system updated its status display. Outer structural layer integrity assessment in progress. Estimated breach time at current force application 18 minutes. She had 18 minutes. She opened the folder labeled E-Day. It was organized the way a person organizes something they expect someone else to use under pressure, logically and simply, with no wasted complexity. 4 packages, each one a compressed archive containing a specific set of documents with a specific recipient already designated. The first package was addressed to the FBI field office in Portland, the second to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, the third to a reporter at the Oregonian, whose byline Wren recognized from a series on coastal development fraud she had read 2 years ago without knowing it would ever be relevant to her life. The fourth recipient was marin.quill.clearwater@gmail.com. Dale had trusted Marin with this. Not just as a messenger, not just as the person who would hand over the photograph and the birthday card. He had trusted her enough to put her in the chain of distribution for the most consequential documents he had ever assembled. Whatever their 25 years as neighbors had been, it had been more than proximity. Wren set up the fail-safe. If the system lost power or network connectivity for more than 10 consecutive minutes, all 4 packages would transmit automatically. It took her 4 minutes to configure it correctly. The impacts against the outer shell were continuing at irregular intervals now, and each one sent a faint vibration through the floor. She was in the middle of navigating to the secondary documentation layer when Brooks's voice came through the external microphone. He had located the mic housing. He hadn't covered it yet. He was standing close enough that she could hear his breathing for a moment before he spoke. "I know you're in there," the voice of a man who doesn't need to raise it. "This is a good facility. Seriously, but I've been through harder structures than this. Come out now and nobody has a bad night." Wren looked at the microphone input on the workstation. She activated it. Before she spoke, she pulled up the personnel photo the system had automatically flagged when the exterior cameras first captured and cross-referenced his face against the facility's security watch list, a database Dale had compiled and kept current. "Brooks Egan," she said, "former Marine 1st Battalion, 7th Regiment, separated 2014. She watched on the backup camera as his posture shifted, almost imperceptible, a fractional reorientation of someone who has just been surprised and is not accustomed to being surprised. "Everything you have done in the last hour has been recorded and is currently stored on a server that is not in this room. Your name is now in that recording." A silence. Then his voice more careful than before. "You can't be sure of that. Check whether Sutton told you about the satellite uplink before he sent you up here," she said. "Then decide how sure you want to be." The drilling began 30 seconds later, faster than before. The system registered the new alert at 12:04. A rotary cutting tool had been applied to the northeast corner of the outer shell, and the structural integrity reading had dropped from 92% to 78 in the time it took Wren to read the number. These tools were not for testing, they were for opening. She looked at the camera feeds. She looked at the files she still hadn't finished reviewing. She looked at the folder in the E-Day package that contained a video file she had not opened, thumbnail image of Dale's face looking directly into the camera lens with the particular focused expression he wore when he was saying something he had thought about for a long time. She moved the cursor to it. Her hand stopped. Not now. Handle what is in front of you first. She navigated back to the communication interface and activated what the system called emergency documentation mode, a function she found in the settings menu through a combination of inference and trial and error. The description was brief: all audio and video input from this point forward continuously encrypted and transmitted to external storage in real time, not a recording that could be seized with the hardware. A live feed to somewhere else. She turned it on. Then the warning she had been watching for appeared. Outer layer breach, northeast corner. Estimated time to interior access 6 minutes. Ren looked at the door in the rear wall, the one she had come through now sealed behind its concrete disguise. She looked at the monitors. She looked at the photograph on the shelf across the room. She stood up. She put her phone in the inside chest pocket of her jacket with the screen facing out and the camera lens uncovered, connected to the facility's network and streaming through it to the same external storage as the documentation system. She checked the time. She thought about Dale sitting in this chair in this room year after year, building something he intended to leave behind. She thought about his voice on that recording. Tired, decided. She walked to the concealed door. She put her hand on the interior release, and she stopped. The fear came then, real and physical. The thing she had been managing with forward motion for the last 6 hours. She was 40 feet underground on a cliff above the Pacific Ocean, and there were 5 people above her who had come prepared to take by force what they had not been able to take by law. And the only thing between her and that outcome was a system she had learned to operate in the last 2 hours and a plan she was building in real time. Her hand stayed on the release. Her forehead dropped until it nearly touched the cold steel of the door. Her phone vibrated. A text from Marin's number. I reached someone. She's on her way. Do not go out until you're ready. Marin had reached a woman, someone who was already moving. Ren straightened. She lifted her head. She took her hand off the release and stood for a moment in the middle of the room, and something in her that had been waiting for permission received it from a source she hadn't expected: a 63-year-old woman on a 2-lane highway somewhere north of Portland, moving towards her in the dark. She went back to the workstation. She had 6 minutes and she intended to use them. She found the facility's external broadcast function, a feature that allowed audio output through speakers mounted in the rock face above ground level, something Dale had installed for what the documentation described as external communication during secure lockdown. She activated it and waited until she saw on the camera feed that Sutton had moved into the cluster of boulders nearest the bunker entrance, close enough to hear clearly. Then she spoke. Sutton, September 28th. You tried to access this system remotely from your office on Southwest Morrison. The system logged your IP and your attempt. That log is in the package that goes to the FBI if my connection drops. She watched him on the backup camera. He went still. The audio from 2019 is there too. The part where you tell Dale to run it through the third account so nobody traces it back. She paused. Everything from this facility forward is streaming live. Not recording. Streaming. There's nothing to seize. On the monitor, she watched Sutton raise one hand toward Brooks. A closed fist. The drilling stopped. The sudden quiet was enormous. The structural integrity reading had reached 61%. They were minutes away from a physical breach. But Sutton was not moving. He was thinking. She could see it even through the low-resolution infrared camera, the quality of a stillness that was not retreat but calculation, a man rerunning his numbers and finding that they no longer added up. Ren sat in the amber-lit room beneath the Oregon cliff and watched him think, and she understood that the next move was hers and that she needed to be outside when she made it. She stood up. She smoothed her jacket. She checked that her phone was secure and streaming. Then she walked back to the door and put her hand on the release for the second time, and this time she did not stop. The door opened inward and the night came in all at once. Cold air, salt, the particular darkness of a coastal cliff at past midnight with low cloud cover pressing down on everything and the ocean working steadily somewhere below, indifferent to the small human drama arranged on the rock above it. Ren stepped out. She had 1 second before anyone reacted, and she used it to position herself where she wanted to be, back to the bunker entrance, facing outward across the open ground where Sutton's vehicles were parked. Not retreating, not emerging tentatively, walking out of the ground the way a person walks out of a room they own. It was Sutton who saw her first. He was standing perhaps 40 feet away near the larger of the two SUVs, and when she appeared, he went through something she had not seen from him before. Not surprise exactly, something beneath surprise, a deeper recalibration, the expression of a man who had built an entire approach around a specific assumption and was now watching that assumption fail in real time. She kept walking until she had covered half the distance between them, and then she stopped. Brooks was to her left, 8 feet back, closer than she would have preferred. The three other men had spread out across the site in positions that were professionally considered. She noted all of this without letting her eyes rest on any of it. She looked at Sutton. "The stream has been running for 14 minutes, she said. "Whatever you say from this point forward is being stored somewhere that isn't on this property." Sutton recovered. She watched him do it, the visible effort of pulling his presentation back into its practiced shape. "Wren," his voice had the quality of someone trying to lower the temperature of a situation they no longer fully control. "This doesn't have to go the way you're thinking." "Tell me what way it has to go then." He took a step toward her, not aggressive. The movement of a man who has spent 30 years in rooms where physical proximity is a negotiating tool. "Dale built something remarkable down there. I understand that now. And there's a version of this where what he built continues, where you're protected, where the legal complications from this evening are handled quietly." "You mean the legal complications of driving 4 men in a drilling rig to a private property in the middle of the night?" "I mean all of it," he said. "I've been in this business a long time. I know how these things get resolved." Wren looked at him steadily. "The filing date on the will was September 14th. My father was admitted September 12th. The attending physician who certified his capacity, I'd still like that name." Something moved across Sutton's face, small and fast. "That's a separate matter. It's the central matter." She kept her voice level. "You had a document signed by a man on morphine, and you had a lawyer certify it, and then you had that lawyer read it to his daughter in a conference room and watch her lose her home and say nothing." She paused. "Petra Holst was in that room with us. She looked at that page for 45 minutes and never once looked up." Brooks shifted his weight slightly. She heard it more than saw it. Sutton's hands moved together in front of him, the same gesture she had watched him make across the conference table, a closing motion, a settling. "Petra is a professional. She performs the duties she's engaged to perform." "Is that what you told her?" Wren asked. "Or did you tell her something closer to what you told Marin Quill, that she should stay out of things that don't concern her?" The second vehicle's door opened. Everyone on the site turned. Petra Holst stepped out of a white sedan that had come up the south track while the attention on the site was directed elsewhere. She was wearing the same clothes she had worn in the conference room that morning, which meant she had driven here directly or nearly, and she was carrying the leather document case she had brought to the reading of the will. Sutton's voice dropped to something that was not quite a threat, but occupied the same register. "Petra, I did not ask you to come here." "I'm aware of that," Petra said. She walked toward Wren, not toward Sutton, her heels finding uncertain purchase on the wet rock, and she did not slow down until she was standing close enough to speak without raising her voice. She opened the document case and took out a sealed envelope. "This is the will Dale Merritt executed on June 3rd of this year, 3 months before he was admitted to the hospital. I prepared it. I witnessed it. I notarized it." She held it out to Wren. "It names you as sole beneficiary of the estate, including this property." Wren took the envelope. She did not open it yet. She looked at Petra. "You read the other one this morning," she said. "I did." Petra did not look away. "I have been practicing law for 22 years. I have never before this year done what I did this morning, and I have not slept since that morning." Her voice had the flatness of someone who has moved past the emotional preparation for a thing and arrived at the thing itself. "Sutton told me the original will was being superseded. He told me the September document reflected Dale's genuine final wishes. He told me the signature issue would not be a legal problem because the capacity certification was legitimate. A pause. He told me a number of things. And you believed them, Wren said. I accepted them, Petra said, which is not the same thing, and I've known the difference for some time. Sutton had not moved during this. He was watching Petra with the focused attention of someone running calculations and finding none of the answers satisfactory. When he finally spoke, his voice had shed the last of its warmth. You are making a significant mistake. Petra turned to look at him for the first time since she had gotten out of the car. Dale left a file in that system with my initials on it, she said. Wren found it, which means Dale knew I was involved, and he chose not to include me in the package he prepared for federal investigators. She held Sutton's eyes. He left me a way out. I don't intend to waste it. Brooks made a small sound, not quite a word. Sutton looked at him. Brooks looked back with an expression that communicated quietly and completely that the operational parameters of the evening had changed in ways that affected his own calculus. Sutton turned back to Wren, and something happened then that she had not anticipated. He laughed. It was not the controlled social laugh she had heard from him before. It was the laugh of a man who has just seen the punchline of a joke he didn't know he was inside short and unguarded and genuinely bitter. You want to know what the actual situation is, he said. Dale knew I was taking money in 2007, not 2015, not 2011, 2007, 2 years in. He looked at the ground for a moment, then back up. He didn't stop me because he needed the arrangement. He needed capital that didn't show up in any filing. This facility needed money that didn't exist on paper. So we had an understanding, him and I. For 11 years, we had an understanding, and we were both making decisions that we both knew were not above reproach. And then when he was done with what he was building, he started keeping records and calling me a criminal. He said it without heat. That was the thing that made it land. He said it the way a person states a fact they have had time to make peace with. Wren let the silence hold for a moment before she answered. He left his own records in there too, she said. His own documentation of what he knew and when and what he allowed. He didn't edit himself out. She watched Sutton's face. He left the whole truth. Not the version that was good for him. All of it. Sutton said nothing. That doesn't make what you did legal, she said. The transfers are documented. The capacity question on the September will is documented. The attempted remote access on September 28th is documented. She held his gaze. But you just said all of that on a live stream, which means the people receiving these files are going to have your own account of the arrangement in your own words alongside everything Dale put together. That's a more complete picture than he could have given them alone. She watched him understand this. The specific moment when a person realizes they have, in trying to complicate their situation, instead resolved it in someone else's favor. Brooks stepped forward. Mr. Vance. His voice was quiet, final, the voice of someone drawing a line. Sutton looked at him. Something passed between them that had the quality of a long, working relationship arriving at a terminal point. Then Sutton nodded once and reached into the inside pocket of his coat. Not a phone, a pen. Petra had already removed the documents from her case and laid them across the hood of the nearest SUV, weighted at the corners against the wind with small rocks she had picked up from the ground around her. A deed transfer, a formal withdrawal of any claim arising from the September will, a statement of voluntary relinquishment notarized in advance by Petra herself, needing only his signature. Sutton stood in front of them for a long moment. The ocean moved below the cliff. The wind came off the water and moved through the grass around their feet. He signed 3 documents in sequence, each one with the same controlled, legible signature she had watched him maintain all day right up until the end. When he put the pen back in his pocket, he looked at Wren one more time. Not with anger, not with any of the social forms she had been watching him deploy for the past 12 hours. He looked at her with something that was, she thought, as close to honesty as he was capable of in this moment. He was right about you, Sutton said. Then he got into the SUV. Brooks retrieved the drilling equipment without being asked. The second vehicle loaded in silence. And one by one, the headlights turned south, and the sound of the engines moved away down the coastal track, and then there was only the wind and the ocean, and Petra Holst standing next to a white sedan with 3 signed documents in her hand. Petra held them out. Wren took them. "I called the Portland field office before I drove up here," Petra said. "They'll want to speak with you tomorrow morning. I told them you'd be available." She closed the document case. "Dale told me something once a few years ago. He said he'd been trying to do one entirely right thing for a long time, and he kept finding that entirely right things are harder to execute than they look from a distance." She paused. "I think this was it. What he built down there. What he left for you." She walked back to her car. She drove away into the dark. Wren stood alone on the cliff above the Pacific Ocean with 3 signed legal documents in her hand, and the wind coming steadily off the water, and for a long time she did not move. Then she went back inside. The facility was exactly as she had left it. The monitors still running, the amber light still steady, the photograph still on the shelf, her own 12-year-old face looking up at the ceiling from behind the glass. She sat down in Dale's chair. She opened the video file. His face appeared on the central screen, filling it close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes that had deepened in the last few years, the gray that had taken over his temples completely. He was sitting in this chair in this room, and the lamp on the desk was the same lamp that was on now, and he was looking directly into the camera with the expression she had spent 30 years learning to read. Not comfortable, committed. "Wren." His voice in the speakers was the most ordinary, extraordinary thing she had experienced in a very long time. "If you're watching this, you figured out the puzzle. I'm not surprised. I want you to know that. I was never surprised, not really by what you could do when you decided to do it." He shifted slightly in the chair that bore his shape. "I want to explain some things. The facility was built between 2003 and 2010. I used it first for research. I didn't want attached to my government contracts work. That was mine, not theirs. After 2015, when I understood clearly what Sutton had done and what I had allowed, I changed what it was for. I started keeping records. I started building what you found in the E-Day folder." He paused. "I didn't go to local law enforcement because Sutton has a relationship with a judge in Multnomah County that goes back 15 years. That name is in the second documentation layer. Federal channels were the only ones wide enough." He looked down at his hands briefly and then back at the camera. "About the money, about what I knew and when, it's in the files. I didn't take it out. I want you to have the accurate version of who I was, not the version that makes me easier to grieve." A silence. "I made pragmatic decisions that I was not proud of. I made them with intention, and I lived with them, and I do not ask you to excuse them. I only ask you to understand that the thing I was building toward was real. The reason for it was real." Wren did not move. "I was not a demonstrative man," Dale said. "You know this. I knew it about myself, and I did not change it as much as I should have. There were things I should have said in person across a kitchen table on an ordinary evening that I did not say. That is the largest failure of my life, and I want to name it plainly." He stopped, restarted. "I was not equipped when you came to me to be someone's father. I knew how to be precise. I knew how to be present. I tried to teach you things that would be useful. I hope they were." On the screen, his face had the quality of a man who has written and rewritten something many times and finally arrived at the version he can live with. "There is one more thing," Eddie said, "about the accident on Highway 30 in January of 1995. Your parents." He said it directly without softening the approach. "I began to suspect something was wrong with the official record in 2012. By 2018, I was certain. The driver of the other vehicle was impaired. The impairment was documented and the documentation was suppressed. I know who paid for that suppression. The name and the evidence are in the final folder, the one with no password in the left-hand drawer of the desk you're sitting at." Wren's hand went to the drawer without conscious instruction. "I did not tell you this when I first knew, because I was afraid," Dale said. "Not of the information, of what it would do to the way you looked at me, knowing I had sat on it. That was a cowardly reason, and I knew it was cowardly at the time. I am telling you now because you deserve the whole truth more than I deserve your good opinion of me." He stopped. He looked at the camera, and in his eyes was the thing he had spent 30 years failing to put into words, visible now because the distance of a recording had removed whatever barrier had kept it from reaching the surface in person. "I love you, Ren. I should have said it on a Tuesday in your kitchen when you were 15, when you were 20, when you were 25, and too busy to call. I had 1,000 ordinary chances, and I spent them badly." He shook his head, a small private motion. "You were the reason for all of it, not the facility, not the evidence. You were the reason I wanted there to be something worth leaving behind." The video ended. The screen returned to desktop. The photograph in its frame on the shelf caught the amber light. Ren sat very still in the chair that carried her father's shape in a room 40 feet beneath a cliff on the Oregon coast, and she pressed her palms flat against the surface of the desk, and she let herself feel the full weight of what she was holding. She cried. Not quietly, not briefly, but completely, the way you can only cry when you are genuinely alone with no performance in it and no management. She cried for the man who had taken her in at 5 years old and never found the words, for the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, for every puzzle left on every surface in a house that smelled like machine oil and old books, for the photograph of herself sleeping that he had kept for 17 years and carried down here and put on a shelf next to the equipment he was most proud of, for her parents on a January highway in 1995 and the folder in the left-hand drawer. She opened the drawer. She took the folder out. She looked at the name inside. She read it twice. She put the folder back in the drawer. She closed the drawer. Not tonight. That was a different road, and it would require a different kind of preparation. And tonight she had used everything she had. She heard a sound at the facility entrance and looked at the monitors. A figure on the exterior camera standing at the entrance, not trying to conceal their presence. Older. Denim jacket. Ren got up and opened the door. Maren Quill was standing outside in the pre-dawn gray with 2 paper cups from a gas station 40 minutes south, and the particular expression of someone who has driven through the night because they decided it was the right thing to do and has not second-guessed it since. She held out a cup. Ren took it. They sat on 2 flat rocks near the bunker entrance facing west, where the Pacific was beginning to separate itself from the sky in the first dilute light of the morning. The coffee was bad and very hot, and Ren wrapped both hands around the cup and said nothing for a while, and Maren did not press her. "He called me after he made the video," Maren said eventually. "He wanted me to know it existed. I think he needed someone to know someone who wouldn't have to carry the weight of it the way you would." "What did he say?" "He said he'd done the best accounting of himself he was capable of." Maren looked out at the water. "He said he hoped it was enough." Ren turned the cup in her hands. "Did he talk about my parents, about what he'd found?" "Not directly. He told me there was something in the last drawer and that it would be hard for you, and he asked me to be nearby when you found it." She paused. "I drove up 2 days ago. I've been staying at a motel in Warrenton." Ren looked at her. "You've been waiting for 2 days." "He asked me to be nearby," Maren said simply. The light was coming up slowly, the way it comes up on the coast in November. Reluctantly and in increments, the sky shifting from black to gray to a pale cold silver. Below them, the Pacific caught the first light and turned it into something horizontal and immense. "He wasn't an easy man," Ren said. "No, he made choices I'm still working out how to feel about." "That's usually how it goes with people who matter," Maren said. "The ones who are easy to feel about are usually the ones who weren't paying full attention to anything." Ren was quiet for a moment. The ocean moved below them. "He said he loved me," she said. "In the video, it might have been the first time he said it directly." She stopped. "I know he did. I always knew. But there's still something about hearing the words." Maren nodded once slowly, the nod of a woman who has lived long enough to understand exactly what that costs a person to say and what it means to receive it even late. In the months that followed, the cliff at Clearwater Point changed. Not dramatically, not all at once. The way things change when someone is paying careful attention and making deliberate decisions rather than simply reacting to what is in front of them. The entrance was rebuilt. The cracked concrete surround was replaced with something clean and intentional, and a small sign was installed beside the door's cedar wood with routed letters. Clearwater Point Foundation, Safe Harbor Program. Understated enough that you would not notice it from the road, visible enough that anyone who was looking for it would find it. The facility below expanded. Dale had left room in the original construction for exactly this additional space, roughed in but unfinished, waiting for whoever came next to decide what it needed to be. What it became was a combination of operational space and living quarters, simple and functional and warm, with a kitchen that Marin helped design, and a library corner that held a shelf of technical manuals that Wren kept not because she needed them, but because they were his. The first woman arrived on a Thursday in February. She came with 2 children in a single bag, and the expression of someone who has run out of most options and is not yet sure if this is a real one. Wren met her at the entrance and showed her around without a speech, without a formal introduction to the program, or its history, or its funding. Just a room and a bed and a kitchen and a place to put the bag. She stayed. Others came. By spring, there were 7 women on the roster, and Marin was driving up from Astoria twice a week to manage intake and run the informal support sessions she had designed herself based on her own experience and what she called the common sense of having been alive long enough to have seen people at their worst and their best and everything in between. Petra Holst, for her part, did not disappear. She had cooperated fully with the federal investigation in the civil proceedings that followed, and the outcome for her was professionally difficult, but not terminal. She lost her partnership track and spent 6 months in a kind of professional purgatory before rebuilding slowly and without fanfare in a smaller firm. The first check she sent to the Clearwater Point Foundation arrived without a note. It was for the full value of the retainer she had collected in the 18 months before the morning she had read a fraudulent will in a conference room and refused to look up. It covered operating expenses for most of the first year. Sutton Vance was charged federally in March. The case was built largely on the E-Day files and the recording from the cliff, which the streaming service had preserved with a timestamp and metadata that made it unimpeachable. The Multnomah County judge, whose name was in the second documentation layer, resigned before charges were filed, citing personal reasons. He was not believed by anyone who read the subsequent reporting. Brooks Egan was not charged. There was insufficient evidence of criminal intent in his presence at Clearwater Point that night, and he had not physically breached the facility. He had, as far as anyone could document, covered a camera lens with a piece of cloth and stood on a cliff top in the rain. Wren did not pursue the matter. She had what she needed. One evening in late April, after the women had settled for the night, and Marin had driven back to Astoria and the facility was quiet, Wren sat in the control room at Dale's desk in Dale's chair and opened the left-hand drawer. She took out the folder. She read it again carefully this time, all the way through, letting each page settle before she moved to the next. The name, the documentation, the insurance record from 1995 with the notations that had been suppressed and the name of the person who had paid for the suppression, who was still living in Seattle, and who, as of 6 weeks ago, had been served with a civil inquiry from an attorney Wren had retained specifically for this purpose. It would take time. These things always took time. But the folder existed and the evidence in it was real, and she was her father's daughter in this. If in nothing else, she knew how to build towards something carefully and wait for the right moment and trust that the moment would come. She put the folder back. She closed the drawer. She turned to look at the monitors. On the exterior cameras, the cliff was still and dark, the ocean moving in the distance, the small sign by the entrance catching a little of the light from the pathway lamp. Below the camera feeds, the facility status display was green across every indicator. The systems Dale had spent years building were running without fault. On the shelf across the room, the photograph in the wooden frame caught the amber light the same way it always did. Her own face, 12 years old, asleep with a book on her chest, unaware of being seen. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at the operational display at the green lights and the steady readings and the evidence of a thing built with intention and care over a very long time. And she thought about what it meant to leave something behind that was genuinely worth leaving. She thought about a man who had never found the words in 30 years of ordinary evenings, who had found them finally in a room 40 feet underground with a camera pointed at his face, who had told the truth about himself fully and without editing and trusted her to hold it. She thought about what it meant to be trusted with the whole truth by someone who loved you, not the clean version, the actual version, complicated and imperfect and entirely real. She reached over and turned off the desk lamp. The monitors gave the room their blue-gray light. The ocean worked steadily beyond the cliff. From somewhere in the living quarters above, very faint through the insulated ceiling, she could hear the sound of one of the children laughing at something. The bright and unconsidered sound of a child who does not know they are safe yet, but is beginning to suspect it. Ren sat in the dark for a while. Then she got up and went upstairs to see if anyone needed anything.